Hey y'all, it's Andrew with Free Tours by Foot New Orleans. Today I'm going to take you on a walk through Crescent Park and part of the Bywater neighborhood. So Crescent Park is maybe a spot you're a little less likely to have heard of, but not because it doesn't deserve it, it's because it's a pretty new space for us. Back in 2008, this space was converted from being part of our Riverfront port area that has served New Orleans for most of its existence into being a long, narrow city park, landscaped with all kinds of native stuff and with walking and running paths through it. So got some beautiful scenery to check out, and if you ever tried to go for a run from the French Quarter, you might have found the area around it sadly lacking for that. This is an excellent option to have in your repertoire. So we'll show you the park, and then we're going to cross out of it to a riverfront neighborhood called the Bywater, which also has really come to people's attention who are visiting New Orleans, and even people who are moving to New Orleans relatively recently. It's a neighborhood that's mostly talked about in terms of how much it has changed since the years of Hurricane Katrina and its recovery. So we'll share some of that story, what it was historically, what it's been more recently, and some of the music, art, restaurants, and bars that make it a worthwhile place to visit. So that's coming up. We're going to start by going down through the park. We'll jump over some railroad tracks onto the streets of the neighborhood, and we'll mostly just do the riverfront portion. There's a ton more to see in the Bywater, but let us know if you want to see that in a separate video, and we'll pay it another visit sometime. So we're going to get started in the park first. Here we go. All right, y'all, setting off. Momentarily going to be crossing that bridge up there over into Crescent Park, which is on the other side of all this flood wall here. But first, I want to give you a quick little orientation to where we are. So looking over this way, the structure in the foreground, that kind of low thing over there, is the French Market, the flea market portion of it, which is right down at the bottom. And you can just see the steeple of St. Louis Cathedral. Over here, the big red building is the New Orleans Jazz Museum. Basically, we are down at a corner of the French Quarter, right outside of it, and Frenchman Street extends off in that direction. This is Elysian Fields Avenue, the setting for A Streetcar Named Desire, and we are setting off deeper into the Marigny. Mostly in terms of actual neighborhood, we're gonna see the Bywater, but Crescent Park goes through both, along the edge of both, and they have pretty related stories. So we will be catching bits of the Marigny, and they are in connection with one another. As we have established in some previous videos too, all of these neighborhoods are former plantations. So the Marigny comes from the Marigny Plantation, named for its last owner, Bernard de Marigny. And plantations, famously these days, tended to have big, elaborate homes involved, and the Marigny Plantation house was right over there, where all this stuff is now. So plantations loved to put their houses by the riverfront, whereas once plantations were developed into being part of the city, it made a lot more sense for the riverfront to be this sort of industrial area tied with the port, and that is very much what the Marigny, and especially the Bywater, developed as. We'll see plenty of that. Industrial sites tend to attract the stuff that, depending on who you ask, could either be called graffiti or street art, and we are going to see a decent amount of that. There's not a lot of it right now, and that is by design. Here along the flood wall, you can see big kind of brownish rectangles all over the place, and on the building across the way, overlapping rectangles in various shades of gray and tan. That is the work of a person called the Gray Ghost, and I will tell you a little about him as we ascend these stairs. So, there is an elevator, by the way. I'm taking the stairs. The Gray Ghost is a self-appointed crusader against graffiti and executes that crusade with swaths of gray paint over usually the kind of tags that you can see on the train cars down there. And, you know, the terms graffiti and street art are pretty down to the eye of the beholder, but sometimes they become pretty clear. And they became pretty clear at one point when the Gray Ghost unwittingly painted over a mural that a building owner actually wanted. and got arrested for it. When you paint on a building and the owner wants it, that's a strong leaning towards street art, and they don't want it strong leaning towards graffiti. So accidentally stumbled into being the object of his own mission, paid a fine, agreed to check with building owners in the future. So with this little view, you can get kind of a sense for the industrial character of this part of the neighborhood. We're in the Marigny right now. We're heading down further that way. It's rare to get an elevated view, which is one reason why alone this is worth doing. Off in that direction, you can see the tall buildings of our business district. And like the way all of this develops, the French Quarter being the original city, everything spreads in two different directions at about the same time. So the city grows upriver and downriver. But the upriver side becomes the English-speaking American side, and that's where the money and the quicker development end up going. And the downriver side, which is where we are, becomes the sort of languishing destination for poorer Creoles as the city grows, and kind of an immigrant central. Not in a way that the uptown area isn't. Plenty of immigrant areas up there. But it was a real mixed bag of those different sorts. And part of that was just a function of how when you have a river, the river is where waste goes historically. And so the Mississippi ended up being prime dumping grounds. And lots of stuff floated downriver. You didn't want to be downriver of the French Quarter if you could help it. So these plantations developed a lot more slowly, were much more kind of rural, and somewhat became land of last resort. So these were a poorer part of the city for a long time. And then in kind of a strange way, they've become a very cool part of the city, for better and for worse, in more recent years. More on that later. So believe it or not, we are in Crescent Park. The park designers, they incorporated a lot of nature into this, but knowing that this was a very industrial, very working class neighborhood historically, they also kept a lot of what was already here. The port used to run all up and down the river, but as containerization came in, it mostly moved over to what we'd call uptown, way off in that direction. And this stuff went into disuse, so the park was developed on former wharf ground in 2008. And nowadays, the park becomes the perfect place to get a view of the rarely seen New Orleans skyline. The odd rooftop bar over in the other direction, and of course, the bridge across the river over there, really are the places where you get to see it, and not a whole lot else. Or of course, a highly positioned hotel room in the downtown. So the marginally tallest building with the rounded top that you can see over there is very shortly slated to open as a Four Seasons hotel. That was a international trade market prior to Hurricane Katrina and was shut down by the storm. So French Quarter, business district, warehouse district, and off over into uptown, hidden behind all of it. And over here we have Algiers Point, the neighborhood right on the opposite side. So as you explore the park, you get to see barges going by, occasionally cruise ships. They love to showboat, go right up against the shore. So this whole covered area ends up being very much a place for workout classes and a lot of skating, like actual skating and rollerblading, versus skateboards, which technically are not supposed to be allowed here, but that is only added encouragement for a great many of the skaters in the world. So if you like this view out over the river, you got the means to come perch on a swing, take it easy and watch the boats go by. It's a heat index of 105 today, so the people who are out here are really eager for it. And hold on, I gotta check and see. These swings make just the most horror movie noises. Little sampling for you. That's not the most egregious of them. And of course, industry-wise, you can see the trains all along the length of the park. So the park is long and narrow. It goes all along this train route, bordering the river the whole way. All right, y'all, we've jumped a little bit ahead. At this point, you start to be able to see down to the actual riverfront, where nature and man-made sort of collide. We got our water birds over there. Looks like seagulls. Yeah, sounds like seagulls. So all of this abandoned structure, very much a part of the design of the park, and you can see the accrued sand down there. This whole piece of riverfront land, this is an area we call the Bywater. It's the kind of margin of land right up against the river on the near side of its natural levee, the elevated land that it forms over centuries of floods. And on this side of the river, actually, so as the river bends, it tends to take land off of one side and add it to the opposite side, and that's how the river steadily changes its course. So in this particular spot, we are actually in a spot where the river erodes its banks. So there used to be a street around where I'm walking now that was called Levee Street. And back in the French Quarter, it still exists, and it has had its name changed to Decatur. But over here, as the levee needed to move further and further in, that street was done away with. And meanwhile, land was added on the other side. And you can imagine, this isn't the most valuable land there is, but land is land. And folks are willing to, pay for land. So when you're in a situation where new land is being created, what is going to happen but lawsuits? So there's a long legal history that involves everybody up to the state Supreme Court. I don't think federal courts ever got involved in this, in deciding who owns land that just appears on a lot, whether it belongs to the public, whether it belongs to private owners, and if so, which ones. So long stories there for the legal nerds to dive into, and I may have missed some kind of federal stuff. We also have these little reminders of where you are. If you know the street grid through the area, you can keep track of how far you've gone by just reading those stones with the street names of the corresponding streets that are out to the left. All right, y'all, we are arriving at a point where we can get a look out beyond the train tracks into the neighborhood for a second. So we have over here repurposed warehouses turned into a public arts school. That's the New Orleans Center for the Creative Arts. We have a lot of art institutions in these two neighborhoods, though we'll be seeing only a couple of them. One that we will see is out over there looking over the nearer warehouse. You can maybe make out the shape of a girl's face, not a regular sized girl, a very large girl. That's Studio B, one of the neighborhood art institutions. We'll be checking that out soon. And right down the middle, there's a street formerly called Press Street, recently renamed, and we will get into that story next. Press Street / its new name is generally agreed to be the dividing line between the Marigny and the Bywater. Dividing lines that are clear are sometimes pretty hard to come by, but when you're talking about especially neighborhoods anywhere, New Orleans being just one example of where people have pretty strong opinions about where things begin and end. But more on that up ahead. I'm going to jump ahead to where we have some beginnings of the landscaping in the park, where the tropical plants really begin. All right, y'all, we reach the landscaped portion. Say hello to an eclectic blend of tropical, Mediterranean, and native Louisiana plants. Mentioned back there that Press Street was a dividing line between the Marigny and the Bywater. And it's funny, it's a generally pretty firmly agreed upon line, but at the same time, if you ask people what the differences are between the Marigny and the Bywater, it's hard. I mean, people feel it, but it's hard to put words to it. So the kind of, I guess, best way to say it is the Bywater is further downriver from the Marigny, so it was kind of still poorer and developed later. And it also kind of received the overflow of coolness from the French Quarter later. So the French Quarter it goes from being this working class Italian, fairly physically run down neighborhood to being an artsy neighborhood to being a tourist neighborhood in the course of the first few decades of the 20th century. And there was a moment of it being really cool there in the middle, but that doesn't last. It always runs further and further away. So the cool ends up running downriver, finds its way to the Marigny in the 60s and 70s. And then the Marigny, especially as you get to the 2000s, is very discovered, and cool goes still further downtown. It also leaves gentrification in its wake, so a lot of native New Orleanians, you don't tend to find people born in town in those neighborhoods today, and that also means that they're generally a lot whiter than they used to be. It just all happened in kind of a sequence. So the Bywater comes to it a bit later, but a lot of the same things are happening there. But the dividing line is really firm for a couple of reasons. The city has divided up New Orleans into 73 official neighborhoods, which don't necessarily map onto people's way of thinking all the time, but in this particular case, the line that they draw between the Marigny and the Bywater also coincides with it coincides rather with a ward boundary. So wards are a system the city came up with early in the 19th century to split the whole city up for municipal purposes like voting, and redrew them a few times. And it was always trying not to really group people by culture, but to have about the same number of people in each one. And it so happened that at the time that was done, the Ninth Ward, the area where we are now on this lower side of Press Street, was very, very sparsely populated. And so the Ninth Ward is gigantic compared to, like, the French Quarter alone has 3 different wards running through it because it was one of the most densely populated parts of the city at the time. And the phrase Ninth Ward is mainly famous from, outside of New Orleans anyway, from the lower Ninth Ward, which was famously flooded during Hurricane Katrina, one of many neighborhoods, but the one that really got heavy press attention for it. And you can kind of see the boundary between where we are now, the upper Ninth Ward and the lower Ninth Ward. Again, when strong boundaries happen, it's because of physical things. So there is, right down past those 2 big ships, that's where a Navy base is located that became disused as of 2005, actually before Hurricane Katrina. But right past that is the Industrial Canal, which is a man-made canal that split the Ninth Ward in 2, turned that side into the lower Ninth and this side into the upper Ninth. This whole up and down thing, y'all, is relative to the flow of the river. The river is flowing that way, though you could hardly tell by looking at it. Up and down also got to be popular terms here, in part through the mouths of transplants, 19th century transplants from New York. When they moved uptown, they used what they thought of as a term for the classy part of the city. And of course, downtown, well, that was for the grungy part of the city where we are right now. But can't beat the view, at least, of the classy part of the city. We'd actually still count all of that as downtown, but it is as a direction uptown of where we are now, if that's not too confusing. Anyway, it doesn't get much better than this as far as views. You actually can watch the New Year's Eve fireworks from over here. That's pretty great. And it feels almost like you've crossed the river. There's so much water in between, but that is the other side of the river. It just does such a hard bend here that you'd never know. So here they've kept this wharf structure. This is actually the wall of a building that used to stand here. And it's a great space for performances, obviously a great space for skateboarding. Try and tell somebody that they can't skateboard on those things. And we have the old wharf structure over here to show what these things looked like before they were incorporated. And you see all this rusty steel that's been tied in. It repeats over there with a landmark that we call the Rusty Rainbow. That is the popular name for it. You can see why. Officially the Piety Street Bridge, but that is one of the other ways in. I'll take you over to there. In terms of the ward names, so while the lower Ninth Ward is generally referred to as the lower Ninth Ward, older New Orleanians who live here still are used to referring to where I am right now, what a lot of younger people call the Bywater, as just the Ninth Ward. So these official neighborhood names, and the term Bywater itself doesn't come into use until like 1920s and 1940s somewhere as an optional neighborhood name, but even then, not really the term of choice. And so it depends really whether somebody is native born or a transplant, how they speak about places. And in that way, like, these names can be pretty amorphous, and you especially see them really, really embraced by like real estate people. So areas near here that have not yet seen a whole lot of transplants move in will sometimes get referred to in real estate-ish parlance as the new Bywater. We've got crepe myrtle trees here, y'all. These are gonna get huge, so it's gonna be shady. One of these days, it'll be much nicer to hang out in a 105-degree heat index once those go up. But for younger New Orleanians, including a lot of native-born ones, you see the adoption of these names, like Bywater and Marigny. So where real estate people have their say, of course, you'll see echoes into things like Airbnb. So when you see claims that an Airbnb is in the Marigny or the Bywater, double check, especially if it says it's in the Garden District. Half the city is the Garden District as far as Airbnb is concerned. So the Rusty Rainbow is in fact a stairway, and one of the architects who was brought in to design this place, really wanting to pay respect to, even though a lot of the old working class residents have long since been displaced from here, wanted to pay tribute to it, that kind of deep genetics of the neighborhood, with this and that wharf structure over there. So if you were staying in kind of the core of the Bywater, this is the likeliest place from which you would come and go. The very tall sides mean there's not a whole lot of view from the top, but it does get you over the tracks into the other side. Or you can go all the way down here and there's another opening down the way. I want to show you one thing in that space, which is a monument a little ways ahead. Otherwise, we will jump on out of Crescent Park momentarily and we'll do some of the Bywater Riverfront. Y'all, I was gonna just jump ahead to the monument, but it being late summer, things going to seed. Look at this little guy. That's what I wanted to stop for. Anyway, we'll now return to our regularly scheduled programming. Okay, one more plant nerd moment, and then I promise I'm done. We have one of the last surviving lilies of the Nile still in town. It's a little late in the season for these. You can see lots of bare ones, but that beautiful shade of blue still survives in one spot. Anyway, thanks for humoring me. And y'all, right down towards the end, we come to a monument, quite a new one. So this was installed in honor of, as it says, the Latin American workers who helped to rebuild New Orleans in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. So part of what made this massive recovery effort doable was kind of all hands on deck from a great many parts of the world, but especially a huge influx of, this side is in Spanish, a huge influx of people, particularly from Honduras and Guatemala, who did an enormous amount of the actual construction work after the fact, bearing in mind that about 80% of the city was flooded and that pretty much every house in that flooded area needed something done to it if it was going to be habitable again. All right, we are down towards the tail end of the park. It opens up into a parking area pretty soon. Right next to it is a dog park, but so as not to betray the privacy of any dogs, we'll just jump right out into the neighborhood. So we will be seeing the part of the Bywater that is right outside of the only ground level entrance that doesn't require either stairs or an elevator into or out of Crescent Park. See you there. And we leave the park, stepping out of the flood walls, crossing the train tracks. Better to look both ways. And heading down towards the street. So nowadays, the street that fronts the river, for all practical purposes, in the absence of old Levee Street, is Charters, which also runs through the French Quarter, all the way down, actually a great distance further than this, but it stops right at the Industrial Canal down there. And there's a lot of stuff right around here that would be worth one's time, local or visitor, to check out. Down at the end of the street is a pretty incredible restaurant slash wine shop slash bar slash outdoor music venue called Bacchanal. They are one of the excellent sort of Mediterranean feeling eateries in town, but plenty of other things right around here too, such as, see the yellow and black stripes back there? That is The Joint, which is an excellent barbecue restaurant, well predating this being such a destination neighborhood. And we also have a music venue called Vaughn's right back here, not quite visible, which is pretty well known for the Treme brass band playing there a lot, and particularly for the television show Treme, using it as a setting. Plenty of other musical, food, and bar destinations, but that's a light sampling. We also have here a historical plaque, which is often a hint that something is missing, because plaques are often for things that aren't there anymore. So all through this land that is used like a park today used to be, actually a good distance back from the street, the Olivier Plantation House. Mentioned that plenty of these areas used to be plantations. All this land was, but the plantation houses were right up here against the street. And the Olivier one was a particularly splendid one, very short-lived, only was around for about 10 years in the early 19th century, and then ended up being sold a few lines down the bill of sale. It ended up in the hands of the Catholic Church, which provided an awful lot of social services here, really most of them. This was a mostly Catholic neighborhood, even amongst the immigrants, who tended heavily to be Irish and German. And so the Catholic Church was the one providing, most famously today, schools, and still most significantly today, but also orphanages and all kinds of things. And they ended up converting first the land around the home and then the home itself into an orphanage for boys. And it stayed that way for quite a while until that started to move into being a state function increasingly under our Governor Huey Long. Stories about him from our video in Baton Rouge, and you'll get why he pulled that under the state banner. But it fell into disuse, was occasionally inhabited, but a lot of times empty, and especially as you get into the mid-century, a lot of old stuff is being torn down. We'd had a little bit of a historic preservation movement by then, but not much of one. It'd been enough to create a historic district in the French Quarter in the 1930s, and that was about it. And when the building back there, the Olivier Plantation, was slated for demolition, some of the preservationists went to great lengths to try to get the place saved, but with no luck. But the organizing they did got connections made and got money raised and interest sparked, such that even though the house ended up being torn down, they ended up forming the Louisiana Landmarks Society. And without the Louisiana Landmarks Society, well, for one, this would all be an interstate highway. We nearly put the interstate highway along the riverfront. It would have passed right along the edge of the French Quarter. Arguably, would have been better for a lot of people had it done that, but it's a very, very different outcome. We also wouldn't have any trees on Esplanade Avenue, and one of the older houses in the city, the Pitot House, wouldn't exist. So that plantation house is missing, but this one is still here. You can see the Lombard Plantation House. One of the very rare survivors, and as far as I know, the only survivor that is in its original location. This was built in 1826. It's a humble little house for a plantation in our old West Indies style, raised up off the ground, airy, big front and back porches. It's actually been nicely restored to what it used to look like, and get you a view over the side. Fun little detail for people who know New Orleans horror stories. The Lombard family acquired this from none other than a woman named Delphine McCarty, who a couple marriages later was named Delphine Lalaurie. So the famous owner of the Lalaurie mansion was once the owner of this land back when it was a plantation. Yeah, they have restored the scoring on the walls. They like to make these things look vaguely as though they were built out of stones, even though nobody was ever fooled. Just meant you could afford a little extra paint. So, very rare example of a surviving plantation house, even if it doesn't necessarily quite live up to what the phrase plantation house sometimes leads people to expect. You know, plenty of them were small and humble. All right, we are passing here along a particularly jungly couple of blocks. You really wouldn't know, passing along this portion of the street, that you were right in the city. You really could think you were in the same kind of small town atmosphere that this place had back in 18 shmoney shma. Folks have room for their own gardens sometimes. There's community gardens all through the neighborhood too. Very unusual to have a big driveway like this. That's part of what gives that sense of it being a small town. And then you spot the Anytime Fitness up ahead, and you're reminded where you are. So I'm going to fast forward a little bit. For the rest of the walk, I'm just going to be going straight along this street. And there are parts where there are real highlights, and there are parts where we can skip a few things. So, catch you in a block or two. Y'all, in a real abdication of my journalistic duty, noticing the do not pass sign here, I just failed to capture video of a city bus passing a pickup truck right next to that sign. Oh, goodness. Classic New Orleans moment. Having jumped ahead a few blocks, y'all, we are definitely at a spot you can't miss. We've got Elizabeth's up ahead. Having mentioned a few restaurants, this is one that I could not in good conscience leave out. Right here along the riverfront. Real food done real good is a solid summary that I think most people would agree with by the time they leave. And the things these guys are known for, among just generally quality Southern and New Orleans food, and of course a colorful facade, which is practically a must here, is they make a thing called praline bacon. Note the sign, giving that the alternate name of pig candy. It's a fun review that describes them as ambitious enough to try to improve bacon. Approximate wording there. And they also make a really rarely seen traditional New Orleans food item called callas, which are kind of like a beignet, but made out of rice, and a thing that used to be sold all over the place in the French market. We are seeing a lot of condo buildings and so on go up in the Bywater. That is definitely in demand. And then we have a nice shotgun house shaped lot. Yeah, one of the big changes that have been seen here. So all kinds of things have transformed about the Bywater in terms of the kinds of businesses you find here. Of course, warehouses turning into housing and art galleries and so on is its own phenomenon. But you see a lot fewer children. There are very few schools here at this point. That was actually an effect of Hurricane Katrina more than anything. And you also, like I mentioned earlier, you see a lot of doubles being turned into singles, which means the overall housing stock is reducing a good bit. And then huge increase in short-term rentals. Right here, y'all, don't miss the street sign. That is Desire Street. Real place. So when we had a streetcar named Desire, it wasn't really all that whimsically named. It was named for the street that it ran to. So that was the end of its route, was Desire Street, before it would turn back and return to Canal. So that streetcar used to roll through the French Quarter. And it's pretty easy to romanticize that idea now, but streetcars back then meaning 20s to 40s, which was when this film was running, were steam-powered and insanely loud. They ended up being widely protested by French Quarter residents as causing property damage. Don't know if that's shaking apart your foundations or just shaking your table so your teapot falls over, but that was their complaint, and of course the noise. And they also said that streetcars were too modern for a historic neighborhood like the French Quarter, and they would prefer a symbol of antiquity, the bus, replace it instead. So yeah, homeowners managed to protest a streetcar out of existence. And Tennessee Williams didn't much care for it either, but he did work it into his play, famously, and the movement to remove it was just coming to fruition as the play hit its biggest success. And so right as the streetcar became sort of a touristic commodity, the decision to get rid of it had already been made. People tried to backpedal, but it was too late. And as people in New Orleans sometimes say, it ain't there no mo. There has been effort since then to create a new Desire streetcar line because it would still have some cachet, but never came to anything except that now we have a line that goes part of that distance, which is called the Rampart St. Claude line. Doesn't go that far though. Euclid Records over here, y'all. Honest to God record store. Hard to find one of these today. They have a few CDs if you're a little less retro, but if you are a records enthusiast, you kind of can't do better than this. They have a location up in St. Louis as well, but this one is pretty heavy on New Orleans artists. Tons of other stuff in there too though, and one of the better souvenirs of New Orleans is a concert poster, and they've got some great ones. Apropos of the neighborhood having been a German enclave, one of many in town, we have Bratsjal, also a music venue, so if you're in town during these times when hearing music outside is very desirable, well, there you go. And you also have right next door Pizza Delicious, which is exactly what it sounds like on both counts. We also have an old ironworks, creatively referred to as the Old Ironworks. Used to hold plays and stuff in here. It's been a while, but now this awful name, Two Girls, One Shuck, references a little seafood pop-up. So that is this block. Actually, take you around the block. Y'all ought to see a little bit of the residential scene. So little of it goes right up against the river that we ought to get you at least one representative block of where folks actually live. Friendly but emphatic, and the work of Dr. Bob. We will see his studio a little further along. Oh, y'all, someone has chosen to immortalize their Katrina cross. This is the kind of marking that was put on houses following Hurricane Katrina. The 9-6 up here indicating that it was searched on September the 6th, not too long after the storm. And then various other indicators of who searched it and what they found, and the lack of anything there on the bottom means no bodies. Oh, our Blue Bike program has just gotten started again, y'all. You can finally bike around with the city's help once more. Those went away for close to 2 years, I guess, year and a half-ish, and they have returned. So when I say the residential atmosphere of the neighborhood, y'all, what we mean tends to be these double shotgun houses and related historic types in all kinds of bright, enthusiastic colors. And here we see another immortalized Katrina cross from the very same day, right in the middle over there. Yeah, and you can kind of tell when a house has or hasn't changed by whether it has one address written on it or two. So probably still looking at a double over here, but yeah, several of these have been turned into singles. So, if you watch the New Orleans newspapers for at least a week, you will probably see some kind of article about how much shotgun houses in the Bywater are selling for right now. It is a perennially popular subject. On the next block around, we're gonna run into a couple of the neighborhood's drinking establishments. So knowing that this is A, a place that's been through a whole lot of change, and B, a place that was very much a working class crowd at one time, the pairing up here is gonna be pretty excellent. So we have up there on the left, humble little building at the start of the next block, a place called Marquis. They're getting close to 80 years old. And that was one of these dive bars for Riverfront workers. A great place for those who are still very much neighborhood full-time residents versus, folks who touch the ground here once in a while. And then next door is the ironically named Country Club, which has been a queer hangout for a few decades, quite a while. And one of the many moments when the Bywater was decreed to have died by many New Orleans observers is when the Country Club's pool in the back stopped being clothing optional. So memorable destination all the same, even without the clothing optional pool anymore. And another block of double shotguns. Y'all, one time I went to an estate sale in one of these double shotguns, which, even if you're not looking to buy anything, are pretty cool ways to see the interiors of New Orleans houses. And then, you buy something as a way of saying thank you. I don't remember which one it was. It was somewhere along here. And whoever had lived there, they said, had lived there for many decades. And speaking of this long-standing working class atmosphere, if you lived in the house your grandparents lived in, they had a linoleum floor, and they had pocket doors which were stuck, but they were open to just this tiny degree. And it was the only way that you could get through from the first room to the second room. And so the same path had been walked from room 1 to room 2 for so long that you could see the linoleum had been completely worn through in this spot. Just a map of where every foot had gone, since the first room of shotgun houses often doesn't see a terrible lot of use. The second room, the path slowly faded as possibilities diverged. But yeah, someone's lived in the same house a long time when. Occasional single shotgun, not as common to see now. And some of these warehouses are still in use as such. A company called AJ's Produce, which provides for a great many restaurants all around town, is headquartered out of this guy. Largely rebuilt, but they've got this great old brick facade on the front, which is around here to the right. And you can see, you will probably spot one of these trucks in the French Quarter at some point. They say AJ's Produce Company, open 8 days, and they've crossed out 8 and replaced it with a very reasonable 7. So here is their sign proclaiming them or proclaiming New Orleans, one of the two, the home of the world-famous Creole tomato. I hope you've heard of the world-famous Creole tomato. And we are back in street art territory, y'all, or graffiti territory, as you see fit. I think some people might see a little bit of both in this setting. And then, on the art front, y'all, we saw a little piece by Dr. Bob earlier. Dr. Bob is famous for signs. He's a self-taught painter, what gets called a folk artist a great deal of the time. and works out of this big warehouse up here, which he has very much made his own, hence the flashing lights up ahead. And his slogan, which you can find on a lot of his signs, is "Be nice or leave," which is kind of an excellent little microcosm of the New Orleans way of thinking. He does have a website, but his phone number still doesn't print the area code. It assumes you already know. Got various Virgins Mary stacked in this evocative little space over here, but the main event is, as the hands down here on the ground suggest, over in this direction. You can't even miss this place from the river, y'all. I didn't film it as we went by, but you definitely know when you're here. Located in the Bywater. So the actual entrance is down here, bedecked with carousel horses, just to add one more element of eye-catching on top of all the others. And it is an open gallery, open studio, so you can step inside, drive inside through this gate here, head on back. We see a reference to Dr. Nut, a beverage that the protagonist of Confederacy of Dunces expresses a lot of love for, old drink that you can't find anymore. And then you can see tourists are welcome. So it's back that way if you want to get some art made out of bottle caps, or maybe something still more ambitious. Here's some of the flavor of that stuff. You will see his signs all over the city. All right, y'all, we're coming into view of some things that we saw earlier from over in the park. So up ahead, on the left side, is NOCA, that arts high school. To have a whole lot of additional graffiti / street art, you decide. As well as Bywater American Bistro as one more example of the restaurant scene here. NOCA does not have a street art program, although I can't speak to the authorship of these across the board and whether perhaps some NOCA students had a hand in their design. But what NOCA does have is a culinary arts program. The word arts is right there in the name, after all. And we have certainly regarded it as an art form here for quite a while. And there used to be even a restaurant that the school operated right around the bend. So by crossing the street here, crossing the tracks and then the street, we do cross over into the Marinee, but into an end of the Marinee that's kind of moved contemporaneously with the Bywater. So again, firm a line as this theoretically is between two neighborhoods, and as firm a line as it definitely is between two wards. People have different polling places on either side of this line. You do get pretty similar vibes on either side, and pretty similar recent history. So, said earlier that the Marinee was part of the endless pursuit of cool a long time before the Bywater was. But a lot of these things that were happening in the hands of relatively recent New Orleans transplants in the 2000s and 2010s, or just things that happened to take place during that time, happened in this lower portion of the Marinee. So if you got all the way over to the opposite side from the river, St. Claude Avenue was definitely a huge center for post-Katrina change. Schools got shut down over there, weren't opened again for many, many years. One school got turned into art gallery space, or art studio space rather, for quite a while. So this whole kind of artsy presence powered by a mix of natives and transplants, or just long ago transplants, definitely took root over here. Been a fun time watching these mosaics take shape over several years by an artist whose surname is True, as you see written right there, and who specializes in mosaics. And more to come. Dang. This has been years in progress. And then right next door, a spot called Catapult, which is one more warehouse, but one that's used as a performance space by a couple of theater companies called Art Spot and Mondo Bizarro. Some of the more interesting, distinctive, and definitely the more locally rooted theater in town, should that be one of the things you're a fan of. And on tiny little Architect Street over here is what used to be the hub of the New Orleans Fringe Festival, meaning Fringe Theater Festival, like the one that originated in Edinburgh, Scotland. All kinds of performances would go on in and around this alley. Went on for years. It was a really lovely presence while it was around. And then the founders / the management kind of parted ways, and you ended up with another festival, completely rebranded, trying to take the whole thing in a different direction, but not using the name Fringe Festival anymore. And one of the founders said, well, if you're doing this other thing, I'll start Fringe Festival going again. And the other owners said, no, we've got that term copyrighted. You can't do that. That would be copyright infringement. And so instead, said individual founded an event called Infringe Fest, which, while not having operated recently, is the most recent way, and hopefully coming back again late this year, to see fringe type theater in town. Over there you can see part of a church. That is the Marigny Opera House. It is a former church turned performance space. Again, very much representative of the transformations that have happened here. One of those changes that happens when you switch from this being a largely natives neighborhood to a largely transplants neighborhood, those transplants adore New Orleans culture. They love being part of second lines and Mardi Gras parades and so on, and you would see many of those things staging from Press Street up here. And you'd see many of them on display in this space across the way, which is a showcase for the work of New Orleans artists in a way that intersects with a lot of our performance traditions. This spot here, called Jam Nola, option to visit if you want a somewhat socially distant way to see some real vibrant New Orleans-y stuff. But it does mean that the neighborhood generally becomes a lot more kind of, I guess, cosmopolitan might be the word, very much more citizen of the world, more educated, and a lot less religious. So being churched is a big part of New Orleans tradition, and that's one way in which these neighborhoods have changed a ton as you've seen transplants come in. Another cluster of blue bikes operating again, and now we get a nice close view of Exhibit B. So over here across the way, don't know if you were able to make her out in the first place, but this is the face that you might have seen. So Studio B, Exhibit B goes back a little further in this place's history. So Studio B began as a space for showing the work of the man who created this and many other murals here and around, Brandon Odoms, who signs his work as B Mike, letter B, M-I-K-E, easy to find online, puts that little crown that's right over her hand that's on our left on his works, part of his signature. And he's got this photorealist style that is generally able to impress even the folks who are not fond of this medium. He had created a ton of works across the river at a public housing complex that then got torn down, and this became a space to show pieces of that set of buildings that were preserved, and subsequently it's become an exhibit space for other works in the same vein, as has the whole space outside. And here we've got quite a few people of importance, but maybe particularly down here at the end, relevant to the geography around us, we have Homer Plessy and PBS Pinchback. And these two are both what the time before the Civil War in New Orleans would have called free men of color. These are folks who had some amount of African ancestry, depending on how much you'd call them different things in the era. Like Homer Plessy would have been referred to as an octoroon, meaning he had 1/8 African ancestors, one great-grandparent. And I mentioned Press Street, the street right here that divides the 8th and 9th wards and the Maronite from the Bywater, has been renamed Homer Plessy Way. So it was right at this intersection of Royal and now Homer Plessy Way, where Homer Plessy got onto a whites-only train car in a very carefully choreographed bit of civil disobedience. A group that he was a part of, called the Citizens Committee in French, organized this gesture as a way to try to legally challenge segregation laws, which were newly passed after the Civil War, and to get them declared unconstitutional. And he was chosen for his pale complexion as the ideal person to carry this whole move out, but they covered their bases in many other directions. When he got onto the train car and then refused to move after identifying himself, it was a detective chosen by the Citizens Committee who actually made the arrest so as to make sure that the charges that were laid would be the most likely to accomplish their ends. Ultimately, local courts, the state Supreme Court, and then finally the US Supreme Court found in different phraseology the notion of separate but equal to be acceptable. And it was Brown v. Board, the much later 1954 Supreme Court case, that for all practical purposes overturned that. And you can see here an allusion to 3 girls who integrated at a very young age a particular school down in the lower 9th Ward, one of the first 2 schools to be integrated, along with Ruby Bridges, one girl by herself, who went to one here in the upper 9th Ward. So Homer Plessy did not get to see that change happen. He died almost 3 decades before that second decision. But having a street named after him well after the fact, if there's any satisfaction to be had from beyond the grave, hopefully that's one that the city of New Orleans can offer. And so we finish kind of where we began, with the pretty unarguable version of street art. Here's Comité des Citoyens, the name of that organization, Citizens Committee, in French, properly quoted. An expression from after the case was done with. So we finish with that. We finish with some more greenery, an urban garden right across the way. And one more view. All right, y'all. Thank you for tuning in with me. If you want to see the Maronite in our hands, there's a video exploring Frenchman Street and a little bit of the upper part of the Maronite besides. And we get a great deal more into some of these civil rights related subjects in our road trip videos, so you can find some of that going back and checking out the Nola to Natchez sequence of videos. And we have walked some beautiful green spaces in New Orleans, like the Botanical Garden and City Park. So check that out if you would like to experience more greenery. And if you would like to tip your guide, you can find the means to do that down in the description below. Drop us a like if you don't mind. Comment if you got any thoughts, any questions. We'd love to talk with you. Thanks for watching, y'all. See you next time.